you might recall that last time we dealt with this, we got up to verse 10. I mentioned at that time that I couldn't find my notes. Couldn't even find the computer in which the notes were. And so I've had to do chapter 4 and 5 all over again. And tonight we're going to continue from verse 11. I noticed when I had finished last week that there were certain things, Greek words within that earlier section that were quite interesting, which I omitted to deal with. We won't go into that, but tonight we have basically a very small section, and within the context there, we have a lot of information, but I think we'll be finishing quite early tonight. I said that last week, in my initial notes, that I had divided this chapter into 2 sections. Verses 1 to 10, contention, its cause, and cure. Then I said that verse 11 to 17, its manifestation in pride and arrogance. And I think that came through quite clearly, actually, in the reading from whatever the translation was that it was read on. But what we're going to do is we're going to analyse what James is saying and see that the things that he is saying goes a lot deeper than what we actually think they would be. Now, as I started to study it again, I noted that there is a division of these notes that a lot of the commentaries actually make a division, and they make 11 and 12 entirely different. They say it speaks of presumptuous speaking. Now, what it is actually talking about is not talking about general conversation. It's talking about presumptuous speaking. Now, to refresh ourselves, I'll read verse 11, and when I want to analyse it, show you first of all what it appears to be saying, and then read behind what James is actually saying. It says in verse 11, speak not evil one of another, brethren. He that speaks evil of his brother and judges his brother speaks evil of the law and judges the law. But if thou judge the law, thou art not a doer of the law, but a judge. Now, in this section, or in this verse, he's actually referring back to chapter 1. And I don't want to deal with that at this stage, but first of all, he says, speak not evil one of another, brethren. Now, what's he actually saying? Is he saying that we should not be judging one another? And I think we've got to be careful in our understanding of this. He says, he that speaks evil of his brother and judgeth his brother speaketh evil of the law. Now, under the context in which that says, it has a lot of supporting verses within the New Testament where we are told not to judge one another. And even Christ said that we shouldn't judge, because with what judgment we judge them, we also will be judged. So in other words, judgment of individuals is wrong according to this context. But what we've got to realise that it's not something that we shouldn't be doing. In Scripture, we are told to judge righteously. Now, there are cases where the brethren ABs of various ecclesias have been required to make judgment. And in fact, their judgment is not to be harsh, but it's to solve a problem that exists in the ecclesia. We find that people who have visualized God as being harsh will tend to judge other people harshly, because the Bible is written in such a way that allows us to demonstrate how we visualize the character of God. So if we're harsh, we will judge harshly. If we are compassionate, we will judge in a compassionate way, not in a liberal way, but in a compassionate way. Now, it is necessary, and I'm saying this, and I'm going to qualify it, it is necessary to judge. You might recall that Paul, when he was speaking to the Ephesus ecclesia, he said to them, "After my departing shall grievous wolves enter in." Now, why does he say that if he doesn't intend that we should judge these situations? There are many occasions where we are told to judge, and Christ himself judged, because he said to the Pharisees and Sadducees that they were whited sepulchres. Outward, they appeared to be righteous, but inwardly, they were ravening wolves. So the point is that judgment is necessary, and we must analyse things. I mean, today I am a Christadelphian simply because I think my judgment determines that Christadelphians have the right doctrine. So what is he speaking about when he says that we should not judge our brethren? And we've referred again last week into Luke 17, and I'd like you to return 15 rather, and I'd like you to turn to Luke 15, because there we have the parable of the prodigal son. And in Luke 15, we find that when the younger brother came back home again, the older brother said, "What's that noise in the house?" He asked one of the servants, and they said, "Look, your younger brother has returned and your father has killed the fatted calf." And he acted with great indignation. And he said, "My father's not given me a party to have with my friends." And so he then makes an assessment of his younger brother. He said he went away, he spent what was given to him on harlots, and he said that he's a wasteful person, yet my father does this. Now remember, the younger son had no contact with the family. He didn't write to the family. So therefore, the older brother would not have known what the true situation is. And it says in verse 28, "And he was angry and would not go into the house. Therefore came his father out to him. And he said to his father, Lo, these 40 years, these many years do I serve thee. Neither transgressed I at any time thy commandment. And yet you never gave me a kid that I might make merry with my friends." So you see, he slandered his brother by saying that something that was not verified, not realistic. And if you have a look at the context, which we don't want to go into at any great detail, the younger brother, although he had gone to a far country and he looked after the pigs, shows how he had declined, but his moral standing had still been within him, because it says earlier that he would fain have eaten the husks that were given to the pigs, but could not. So you see, he wasn't prepared to take things that didn't belong to him. Now, why was this parable uttered by Christ? It goes back into verse 1 and says, "Then drew near unto him all the publicans and sinners for to hear him. And the Pharisees and the scribes murmured, saying, This man receiveth sinners and eats with them. And he spake this parable unto them, saying." So therefore the parable is a product of the behaviour of the Pharisees and Sadducees and the scribes. And it said that they perceived that he was speaking of them. So you see, Christ made a judgment. He made an assessment. But he did it in such a way that was intended to gain and not to lose. Now, the point that James is making in what he is saying, he's saying that we are not to judge. In other words, our judgment is to be righteous judgment. And Christ did it, and Paul did it in Corinthians. So judgment is a vital part of following Christ. We have to understand how inconsistent people may behave. So that's the first point. Judgment is necessary. Now, I want to make one last point in this to prove that when we are in situations, we must judge. Now, you might recall when Absalom rebelled against his father, he was going to take the throne from his father. And so he held a religious feast down to the south of Jerusalem and encouraged all David's close friends to come down to this feast. And while they were down there, he rebelled against his father. And David did not have those people there to help him. So he fled the city. But if you look at the context and what happens, there is an indictment placed upon those of David's friends who went to the south. Why? Because they had not judged accurately the character of Absalom. They should have perceived what Absalom was about in holding this feast in the south. And the point is, if they were not to judge, why would they have been criticised for abandoning David in his time of need and being down in the southern part? So we find that judgment is necessary, but it's accurate judgment. Now, I'm going to tell you what Barclay says. He says, "Speak not evil one of another, brethren. He that speaketh evil of his brother and judges his brother speaketh evil of the law." So what Barclay says, It is backbiting. It's a group of people who get together and gossip and destroy the character of another. So if we are to judge, we must be careful in our judgment and not vocalize those things. We have a right to analyze how we feel about it. But you vocalize it, and you might be destroying the character of someone and be entirely critical when no criticism should be done. So what's it saying in that context? Let's get within the context. It's saying that backbiting, criticising our brethren and sisters vocally is wrong. Now, I can have an opinion, but provided that opinion is not verbalized, then I am not doing anything contrary to what James is saying. So he says backbiting, destroying the character of another person, these are the things that are wrong. So he says, he that judges his brother speaketh evil of the law. Now, back in chapter 1, he talks about the importance of being a doer of the law. Chapter 1, verse 22. But be ye doers of the word, and not hearers only, deceiving your own selves. So the point that James is making is that if I have a problem with a brother, I should discuss it with him, but not go around slandering and criticising behind his back. That would achieve absolutely nothing. And he says, if we do that, we judge the law. How are we judging the law? Well, Paul in Romans says that the law is good. It is just. So if we go around criticising, we're saying where the law says love your neighbour, then we are not doing what the law says. We are fulfilling our own ambitions. We are elevating ourselves in an environment where we are destroying someone else. So he says, but if you judge the law, thou art a doer of the law. Thou art not a doer of the law, but a judge. And he says, look, your opinion amounts to absolutely nothing. He says, God, there is one lawgiver, and there is one person who is able to save and destroy, verse 14. Who art thou that judgest another? Now, I want to make that point very clear. It's not an assessment of the character of an individual. It's being vocal about what you consider that person to be, and at the same time destroying his character. So he says in verse 13, go to now ye that say, today or tomorrow we will go into a city and continue there a year and buy and sell and get gain. Now, why does he jump from one statement to another? In verses 11 and 12, he talks about judgment of another. Then in verse 13, he talks about their behaviour, in that they have set their targets on becoming wealthy. Now, it seems to me that he jumps from one subject to another. And I know that James is logical. James just doesn't jump from one point to another. So there must be a connecting thought between 11 and 12 and verse 13. And I think it is this. He is saying that if our speech is not contained, if we are unspiritual in the way we speak, it will manifest its unspiritualness in the way we live. And he's saying, you're making great ambitions. What you are doing, you're saying, I'm going to go into another city and I'm going to get gain. I will buy and sell. His mind is not centered on God. It is centered on his own ambitions. Now, there's nothing wrong with making plans, but you have the person who is greedy for gain. It is like the man who had great wealth. And what he did, he built bigger and better barns that he might house his wealth. His preoccupation was not with God. And Christ spoke about this in Matthew 7. He says, build up treasure in heaven and not on earth. And here is a man who is preoccupied with getting wealth. So it's not the finances that he is speaking about. He's speaking about being greedy. Now, if you have a look at chapter 5, it says in verse 4 that he's even reluctant to pay his workmen what was their due. While it was in his possession and it belonged to someone else, he was greedy and he was not prepared to hand these things out. So he says, you cannot make your life a priority. You've got to make God a priority. Now, here we're going to go and look at something which is fairly important. And we're going to look at, he says, you know not what tomorrow might bring, for what is your life? It is even a vapor, and appeareth for a little time, and then vanishes away. He spoke about those things in chapter 1. The rich man is like a flower of the field. The grass withereth, and the flower fadeth thereof. Yes, he might appear ostentatious in the eyes of other people, but he also is subject to death and to vanity. It is even a vapor that appeareth for a little time and then vanishes away. For ye ought to say, if the Lord will, ye shall live, we shall live and do this or that. Now, here we're going to deviate and we're going to look at certain things. He says we should say, if the Lord will. And there are people who take that statement very liberally or very realistically. And you hear them saying, if the Lord will, if the Lord will, if the Lord will. He's not saying that. He says, keep in mind your condition. You are mortal. You are subject to sin. You're going to die, and God is in control of your future. The rich man who built those barns didn't see the fruition of his wealth. That evening he died. Now, why is James emphasizing the fact of his mortality? And that's what I want to deal with. We'll be finishing a lot earlier than I intended, but what we have to realize is, why are we mortal? Why am I mortal? Now, if I was asked you that question, some would say, I am mortal because Adam sinned, and sin is a consequence of mortality. That is only part of the answer. Naturally, we suffer because we are descendants of Adam and Eve. But we cannot say that we die because of Adam's sin. Why can't we say that? What about a stillborn child? Has that sinned? And God says, the soul that sins, it shall die. So to answer the question, why am I mortal, shows the merciful character of God. Now, I'm going to take you back to 2 Corinthians, and I want to deal with this so that we all understand precisely what is being said. In 2 Corinthians chapter 1, Paul makes a statement. He says that I am, or God imposed mortality on Adam and Eve that they might learn to lean upon him. Now, how should we say it? We can't turn around and say, I am mortal because of Adam and Eve's sin. In the Unity booklet, Christadelphian Unity in Australia, the accepted basis, it says, we believe that Adam was made of the earth and declared to be very good. Because of disobedience to God's law, he was sentenced to return to the dust. He fell from the very good state and suffered the consequences of sin. You see, it wasn't the penalty, it was the consequence of sin, shame, and defilement, a defiled conscience, and mortality. Now, have a look how Paul describes our mortal state. Why are we mortal? In 2 Corinthians chapter 1, he says, in verse 8, for we would not, brethren, have you ignorant of our troubles, which came to us in Asia, that we were out of measure, above strength, insomuch that we despaired even of life. Then he goes on to say, but we have the sentence of death in ourselves, that we should not trust in ourselves, but in God, who raises the dead. So you see, Paul, in analysing his mortal state, he saw it not as a thing that God did out of anger, but out of mercy. Because being mortal, we realize that we are weak and we are dependent upon God. And so in using mortality as the means of correcting Adam, he was placing him in a position where he might learn to lean on him. Now let's go to Hebrews. In Hebrews, it makes a statement that makes this even more clear. In Hebrews chapter 5, I think it is, Hebrews chapter 5, he says, speaking of Christ, though he were a son, yet learned he obedience by the things that he suffered. Now, for years and years, I could not understand what I was talking about. Learning something means that you go from a lower state to a higher state. In other words, Christ, in learning obedience, but he was always obedient. So how did he learn obedience? The implication, if we take it on the surface, seems to indicate that he was not perfect at the beginning, but that is not what is being said. And let us make that very clear. It is not what is being said. It says the mortal state of the Lord Jesus Christ was the very means that made him rely upon his Father and implement the righteousness of his Father in his life. He was utterly and completely dependent upon his Father. So when we come back to James, those ideas, those concepts are what he is saying. Keep in mind your mortality, because God used mortality as a means to make men lean upon him, to realize that they are but dust and ashes and that they must lean upon him at all times. So when we come back to James, he says, whereas we know not what shall be on the morrow, remember your mortality. Remember your life. It is a vapor. It appears for a little time and then vanishes away. There's nothing wrong with making goals in your life. But when those goals supersede what we should be doing in the truth, then it is wrong. He says, for that, ye ought to say, it is the Lord's will. We shall live and do this or that. Keep your priorities right in life. It is your mortality which will help you lean upon God and not run after your own ambitions. But he says, now you're rejoicing in your own boastings. In other words, you're not leaning upon God, you are saying what you are going to achieve. All such rejoicing, he says, is evil. Therefore, him that knoweth to do good and doeth it not to him it is sin. So you see that logical statement, he says, if our priorities are going to be going to another city, to be chasing after the wealth, to be building up our own funds so that we can have an early retirement, he says we've got to realise that that is not in accordance with God. Now, I notice I'm actually about 20 minutes early, but that takes us to the end of that section there. And the statement he is saying is, look, keep in mind your failings. Keep in mind your mortality. And in keeping in mind your mortality, you will learn to lean upon God and not chase after your own ambitions.